Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. In this episode, I'm very excited and very happy to bring the conversation I had with Blair LM Kelley. Blair is an award-winning author, historian, and scholar of the African American experience. She is currently the Joel R. Williamson Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and director of the Center for the Study of the American South. She has a bachelor's, master's, and Ph.D. all in history, and has certificates in African American studies and women's studies as well. She is the author of 2 books. The most recent, Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class, which is what we talk about in this conversation. She talks about why she wanted to write the book with some biographical elements along with historical fact, and she talks about this kind of narrative way of telling history, which I think is wonderful. She talks about why, when we talk about the working class, we many times think of white working class and how the working class is a big tent and there's many different races and ethnicities, including African Americans. We talk about class and race and those themes for Black Americans. We talk about the impact of slavery on working class Black Americans. We talk about the role of the church for building and organizing community. We talk about the history of Black washerwomen and their involvement with unions, interactions of Black women workers with white women, the Great Migration, Porter Union, Black maids, and current themes with the Black working class. I have to say, I greatly enjoyed her book. It was really, really informative for me. I didn't know a lot of the information here. And I think that that's right. She rightly says in the conversation that, Black history is American history, and I firmly agree with that, and all of the aspects of history, and that's super important. And it has been unfortunate that for much of the history we learn in primary school and secondary school is not a lot of perspectives that are shown, whether it's with Native Americans or whether it's Black Americans. We kind of learned the kind of basics, but we're now, I think, having a more robust and balanced view of history in the United States, and I think maybe globally as well, that's looking at all perspectives, and that's super important. And Blair is absolutely lovely. She's super brilliant. I so enjoyed this conversation with her, and her book is absolutely wonderful. You can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. So go over there and subscribe and share with your friends. And also on YouTube, same thing, Converging Dialogues. And so now I bring you Blair LM Kelley. I'm here with Blair LM Kelley. Blair, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm super excited for your book, which we're gonna talk all about. The book is Black Folk: The Roots of the Black Working Class, and it's out everywhere, and everyone should go pick it up. Before we get into it, though, why don't you tell listeners who you are, what your background is professionally, academically, and what you're currently up to?
Well, I consider myself a historian of the Black experience, and I've been doing professional historical work in the university setting for a long time. I'm currently the Joel R. Williamson Professor of Southern Studies at UNC in Chapel Hill.
Very nice.
And I'm the incoming director of the Center for the Study of the American South, which I'm really thrilled to be at the helm of.
Oh, nice! Congrats. That's very nice.
Thank you.
That's right. So what you're telling me is that you're just busy all the time. That's what it is. You're just
I
busy.
have been busy for a minute. I'm busy for a minute, but I call it a blessing to be busy at the thing that I love to do. So
absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So I guess this book was great, and big thanks for you and your team sending it to me and letting me read it. I want to ask kind of a little bit in terms of the style in which you decided to do this. So a lot of the book has biographical elements
Mhm.
from your own family historically and even more recently, which I think is what kind of really makes the book come alive a lot more. It feels very honest and raw in some places,
Mm,
authentically so, which was
mhm.
great. It just gives it a lot of life into more just facts and history and things like a lot of history books do. I guess what was your kind of intention or reasoning for kind of incorporating your own family history along with talking about many aspects that a lot of folks won't know about American history and Black American history?
So for me, I love to write, and I love poetry. I love reading. I love novels. I love my favorite author is Toni Morrison by
Mm,
far,
mhm,
of any genre, and her ability to uh, draw in bits of history to a narrative was inspirational to me from the very start of my thinking about the possibility of being a writer. And so when you teach history, you end up with a lot of students who are like, oh, I hate reading history. And I never, it's so boring. And when you do run into a book that they love, you take note.
mm,
And I was noting that a lot of the histories that people loved had this more narrative style,
mm,
were drawn through the stories of people. Um, I did a Twitter survey one year, several years ago, and I said, "What's your favorite history book?" And Warmth of Other Suns blew everybody out. And that warm, personal version of telling a national narrative
mm,
was what people were so excited about. And so I was like, well, why can't academic historians do this work too?
mm,
Why can't we
mm,
tell stories in ways that are not just focused on the ways we want to debate or discuss ideas with each other, but also pull those ideas into a more personal, a more raw, a more real way of thinking about this history. And for me, I think this way, I teach this way, I talk about my mother, I talk about my grandparents
mhm, mhm,
when I teach. And so it was natural for me to say, okay, this is how I'll have to tell the story.
mm,
As I began to propose the book, their stories kept flying into my mind as the way that I would want to narrate it,
mm,
along with thinking through the process of oral histories. I'm an avid oral historian. I've
mm,
taught that for um, more than a decade, and it was one of the first things I did as a historian at Duke University was participate in a project called Behind the Veil.
mm.
And so people's lives as history really is the frame for which my mind works. And so it was a natural fit to do that again here.
Yeah, no, I think one of the biggest things about it is that it makes it just so relatable. I mean, I'm sure there's a different way in which it can be relatable to other Black folks reading this, but even for folks like myself, I'm obviously not Black, but to to read it, it's like, you know what, these are human stories and these are fellow American stories, and obviously there's a lot of dark chapters, but it's a way of having this kind of connection and this ability to kind of relate, which is I just found super powerful and super captivating. And it made all the other facts and details of history less boring and things to gloss over. It's like, oh, well, how can now I'm kind of interested. Yeah, I've got the narrative part. Let me read all the other stuff of what happened. And so it is a very nice kind of compliment there. Um, one of the things that appealed to me about the book was the Black working class. And so we can kind of in the beginning here, we can talk about the working class. So I find like politically, a lot of people talk about the working class, and a lot of people, I think, maybe um, not intentionally so, but I definitely think it happens. Is when people talk about working class, I think about white folks, white working class, in Rust Belt states and all the states we care about every 4 years for a presidential election,
Yes.
right? And we talk
We rush
about
into Ohio.
right to Michigan and Wisconsin, right?
Yes,
And certainly those folks are important. I just say all folks in
absolutely.
the U.S. are important. But I think a lot of the times people think about the working class, and a lot of the times they typically think, the white working class. Um, and I'm not too sure where all of that kind of comes from. But I guess the one thing that I'm most interested in, and there has been more conversation about this, I'd say, in the past couple years. I say, like, well, wait a minute. The working class is black folks, it's Latin folks, it's white folks, it's a lot of different people that
Hmm.
are in that tent, that big umbrella. And so, what is it that you're trying to show in the book, and obviously through your work, of why we haven't explored that history of, at the very least, a wide racial kind of tent of the working class, and why, what makes the kind of uniqueness of the black working class in the United States so important to kind of understand, and maybe what you're trying to do here with the book.
I think the country has had a habit of not including Black people in the working class, in part because of enslavement and of segregation and sort of the disassociation that they had for Black people as full citizens, right?
Mm,
So, for most of our history as a country, Black people weren't full citizens,
mm,
and they were enslaved, they were subjugated under segregation laws, they were prevented from voting. And so the habit, when you think of citizen, is not to think of a person of color. The normative citizen is a white male person. And so it takes some real thinking and some real pushing to say, well, you know, let's reframe how we think of the working class and whose voice might matter. Uh, in the recent elections, we've seen that the voice of the Black working class mattered pretty significantly with the coming of folks like Stacey Abrams, who basically said, no, if we go from community to community um, and really talk to Black voters, Black working class voters, they'll come out, they'll be actualized, they'll understand where they fit
mm,
in this voting process. And she's not the first. She's really the
yeah,
latest to sort of understand the power of those communities, their interest. Black voters are more working class than any other set of voters in the country. So
mm,
it's just an interesting mind game to constantly separate Black people from their labor, from their place in society,
mm,
and from the real service that they provide for the country as a whole and have throughout our history. But it's interesting. Oftentimes when I'm teaching and I say, Black Americans are terribly American. They got here well before most other Americans arrived.
mm,
And yet we tend not to think of Black people as really actually American. When I was a little kid, people would say, go back to Africa,
mm,
not realizing that, where I grew up, their ancestors were people who came in the 1920s and 30s and 40s.
mm,
And my ancestors arrived on this continent before the American Revolution.
mhm,
And so the idea of going back,
mhm,
wouldn't be um, something that even made sense.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so, and yet we still do that. We don't think of Black Americans as being fundamentally from here.
mhm.
Um, and we really do a mind game to separate Black folks from the American experiment. But we're here, and we've been here for a while. And I think if you tell our story and you center it for a bit,
Mhm,
you end up with a different kind of understanding about what's possible.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. I really resist this, whichever group or side is doing it. This idea that black folks are that they have this experience that's not part of the American experience, and I think that obviously each racial group has their own histories and cultures and norms, but you know and yes, I think you're absolutely right. In some ways, black Americans have been here the longest. They've been here before many other folks, and their history is got all of these twists and turns, ups and downs, and but I don't think that you could ever say for folks currently that there's this piece of removal of this kind of Americanness. It's very strange to think of it
There's
that way.
certain tropes that we lean into, and it's just one of them. My other favorite one is that we're a country of immigrants, and I'm like, Native and Black people have something to say about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's very interesting how, I don't know, people sometimes when they emphasize these kinds of um, phrases or terms, you're emphasizing one thing and maybe even not intentionally excluding all the other things that we haven't really recognized, and it's like, well, wait a minute, what about all these other folks that have been here? And I certainly think the United States is a country of immigrants, but not only that, or not even primarily that. It's that plus, or it's, there's others groups of folks that have been here as well. So I think it's a weird thing where people emphasize or overemphasize or underemphasize one more than the other. I guess the question I have here about the Black working class for a minute is, I don't want to make it an either or. I think it's probably both and. Where do you see, I guess, this kind of intersection of kind of race and class, right? Because in many countries, class is the kind of predominant central theme, for better or for worse, right? You have people where it'll be a very big split. There'll be very, very, very poor, and then there'll be the very wealthy, and class is kind of the big thing people will kind of notice. I feel like for Black Americans, is it maybe a kind of both and kind of sorts, where obviously there's a class piece of things, but then there's also a racial component as well. And again, it's not to make it a either or, but how do you see these ideas of class? When you think of working class, we usually think of lower middle class or right in the middle class. And so, how does this apply, I guess, for Black working class folks and this idea of both socioeconomic status and race?
I think for us, it's interesting, and it's got a different kind of history. Um, for most Americans, if you push them to describe themselves in class terms, they'll just say, "Oh, we're middle class," and so you'll have people who are making an hourly wage who would describe themselves that way, and you have people who are making like $300,000 a year who would describe themselves that way, depending on where they live and how they perceive themselves. So for Americans, class really doesn't have like core meanings that make actual sense based on like numbers or anything like that. And for Black Americans, I would say, because for so much of our history, Black people have been prevented from having the access to move up, to have jobs that were white collar, to have other kinds of things. You ended up with Black people with great educations, who were college educated, who were doing hourly work, working for tips, being prevented from doing the kind of things that they were capable of doing. And then you had so many of us who, that was the only possible option for them, is to be of the working class. And so when we think of the Black working class experience, there's very few Black Americans who could say, I'm not directly related to somebody in the working class. As I go and talk about this book with different audiences, I'm hearing, my grandmother was a washerwoman. My grandmother was a domestic. My grandmother, so there's nobody, my mother, my aunt, everyone's got a very proximate story for you, even if they are not currently doing working class labor, but many of them are in my audiences as well. And so we are overrepresented in those ranks. And so it was an interesting place for us to start. Race, I think, does this interesting intersection with class in this country, because Black people are classed as not being able to be thought of as the upper class, the elite, for the most part, that there's a leveling that comes around Black life that makes it really difficult for the most wealthy Black people to really experience wealth in a parallel way with people who are white in this country. in part because there's their lack of intergenerational wealth, and in part because they would be related to people who are working class and need help. And so you would spend a lot of time, helping a parent or a sibling or someone else. So the funds you would earn at, in a more elite job are used to support larger numbers of people. As is true, I'm an academic that works for a state, so it's not like I've ever been wealthy. But at the same time, I'm also helping other people in other households. And I have a 3-generation household. And so oftentimes that doesn't have to happen because of intergenerational wealth and others. With that wealth gap is a reminder that the Black middle class is the least stable class in the country. So that race and our histories of race and the histories of dispossession destabilize those notions. And it doesn't really operate as cleanly in this country because of it.
Yeah, I like the way you mentioned that about for folks that are for Black Americans that are more affluent, or if you would say, they're wealthy, that's still going to be a different experience just because of, they don't wealthy Black folks don't live on an island somewhere. They're connected with obviously histories and family that maybe aren't maybe in that space or don't have generations of that space, which I think is it's not something that I've thought about much, and I would imagine a lot of people haven't thought about it that way. Of like, whoa, that's much different than maybe it is for a different type of experience for somebody else that maybe does have, generations where they had at least, a few wealthy people in their family, or they were upper middle class, and it was a little bit easier, kind of just from the starting line. So that's a very interesting, kind of experience, I can imagine. So you talk about in the book many things, and so we won't cover all of them. Obviously, people should read the book.
Yes, read the book.
So obviously, you do start in the beginning about talking about the history of slavery in this country. Many people have talked about obviously this topic. It's again dark chapter in our history. You make this as it relates to your book, though. You make this link between this history of slavery and how Black working class folks were treated, Reformation and subsequently. How could you talk about how Black folks coming to the U.S. not as immigrants, we mentioned this earlier, but as slaves, and I do think one of the unique, terribly, but one of the unique differences with slavery in this country is this removal of folks, many hundreds of years ago, but removal from one continent to another to be, treated, sold and treated, worse than, some animals. I mean, there's just terrible things. But that removal is such a, unfortunately, a unique aspect of I think slavery here in the U.S. So could you talk about how there's this distinction of Black Americans or Black folks coming to the U.S. not as immigrants, so this removal, and then how that works? Kind of how do we see the I guess the remnants of that in the Black working class after that, which would be different than say Asians or Latinos or other people that do come here as immigrants?
So there's the powerful need to remake because of that removal, because peoples are being sold by other Africans to Europeans and put in this, what historians have called the triangle trade, and then drawn into the Americas. And they're separated. They're purposely kept in ways that prevented rebellion from occurring. So you would often be shuffled with people who spoke a language that you did not speak. So you couldn't really remake exactly who you were before. There were some connections, of course, and ties culturally, but you had to figure those out, and you had to figure out a common language and a common way of being in order to survive. You had to develop fictive kin if your folks were gone from you and you were separated, as most people were. And so there is a remaking out of the remnants of memory that people have and the things that can survive. Cultural practices, for example, survive better than language. which is violently suppressed, right? But there is this desire to survive and the desire to remake family that comes and is so important and so strong within the community of the enslaved. And because of that need for survival, that need for community, that need for faith, we become a new people. And that those people understand the value of their labor. They understand the power that it has on this new land and how it's making people wealthy and powerful. And so they have a different relationship to work. They have a different relationship to those that they work alongside. And so when they come into freedom, they bring that with them. And they have a real ethic of care and community that is quite profound because it's at the heart of who they are as a people.
Yeah, you talk about this in the book about, as we mentioned before, that Black Americans are just as much an American story as any other group or race or ethnicity, and that Black Americans built and rebuilt vital spaces such as communities, labor unions, obviously religious components as well. So how do we emphasize that story, right? Which is, I think, part of what you're doing in the book, as well as not forsaking the tough historical facts of slavery and Jim Crow and segregation, all those other things. Basically, my question here is how do we have this? You don't want to look at like, well, here's the resiliency pieces of it, and this is great, and look at how we've
a tough word, right?
right. We've done this, but not. It's a balance, right? Obviously, we do know many of the histories of segregation and slavery, but also there is these glimmers of hope throughout those periods too, and I think that builds obviously strength and character. How do you find that balance historically when you're telling, you want to have an accuracy of our history that doesn't shy away from all of these tough, aspects for hundreds of years, but also look at the aspects that we're able to give a lot of, in this scenario, in this case, the Black community, some hope and some resilience and some strength as well. How do we tell those kind of different stories, I guess, at the same time with accuracy?
I think for me, it's about Black humanity, right? So if we get to the point where we just say what happens to Black people and we take them out of the story, you get just the subjugation, you get just the suffering, and those things are real, and people survived what we think of as unthinkable. At the same time, they survived what we think of as unthinkable. And so it's also an important part of the project to look at that survival and to look at the character of those who survived and look at the belief systems that made them come together in terrible circumstances. And, it's a human story because oftentimes we face unthinkable things and terrible things and times that are quite hard. And so we can look to our past as an example of how people did that work, how we created communities of care in the midst of hard times. So I don't think it is either an either or. It's not a way of trying to make it Pollyanna and fun. Isn't it great that everybody was enslaved because then they came together and had community? Right. For me, it really is. People suffered and struggled and were part of a worldwide system that made some people very wealthy and other people's were destroyed. And so it's not to paint that over, but to instead just put the person back at the heart of that question.
Yeah. Well, you do just that throughout the book. And one of them is, you mentioned, I believe, your ancestor, Henry, right? It was this blacksmith. And you kind of talk about that story, but then broaden it and say how many folks, like him, were able to, you talk about develop a working class mindset by earning these by making earnings on the margins of enslavement with small amounts of money on the side. How is this kind of mm, the genesis or the kind of origins of what a working class, a black working class, where it's like, okay, yes, there's the enslavement, but I'm also going to try and push a little here on this if I can, and do this extra thing and make some money. You talk about the blacksmith um, trade, and how you see a little bit of this. So maybe just chat about how that kind of formed and developed.
So there were opportunities for some enslaved people in some circumstances. If they had what was considered a skill, if they were a carpenter, a mason, a bricklayer, a blacksmith, to earn extra money. And then also for the enslaved who lived in rice planting cultures, particularly in South Carolina, for example, they were on a task system. And so oftentimes you see a variety of people selling um, vegetables or cooking dinners or having sort of small things that they did on the side.
Mm.
And so there is an economy that exists. So it's just a reminder, I think, that the enslaved did not come out of slavery with no sense of what an economy looked and felt like. That it was always very proximate to probably the majority of the enslaved, that they understood that was part of what was happening. Now, those things weren't fair or equitable.
Sure.
Sometimes people were skilled and then just hired out, and all the funds would go back to the person who held them in bondage and things like that, for example. So not, necessarily a liberatory pathway
Right. Right.
for most. For some, it could have been,
Mhm.
if they were able to negotiate that.
Mm.
But it's just a reminder that the enslaved were not completely divorced from the understandings of an economy.
Mm.
But I would argue that, even those who did not have these particular skills understood the wealth that was being generated from their labor, and understood in their interactions with poor free whites who were their supervisors, what that world looked like. People were paying close attention all around them. And really, we can see from the evidence of what happens in freedom that they understood very well the place that they occupied in the world.
So you also, I wanted to mention it here because I know it plays an important role culturally. Is the church? The church plays a big role for Black Americans historically and currently. How is I guess the church? And you kind of mentioned it there of you have early on you have people coming from all these different parts of Africa, so it wasn't all just a monolith, right? Nobody spoke the same language and were able to have the same. It was all different. What do you think it was? I guess as time went on, how the church became instrumental in having this, like their own space, like this was their own space, their own kind of environment, and how that idea of one's own space and environment could say, well, how do as we see later on in history, there's this idea of how do they do that for economically or vocationally in a working class system. I guess just talk about the role that space and environment with the church played for Black Americans.
So, the enslaved Africans were people of faith. They had existing faiths when they came. And as you said, it would be difficult to maintain those faiths whole cloth because of the disruption, the rupture and the disruption. Those are separate words of what happened to them. And yet pieces of it survive, songs, rituals, all those kinds of things. And so that you see those things imbued into a radical Christianity that develops over time among the enslaved. Also pieces of Muslim faith. There were those who were enslaved who were Muslim in West Africa. And so you see those residual beliefs. You see folks who maintain their beliefs separate from Christianity as well. But all of these things happen in resistance, right? None of this is promoted by those who hold them in bondage. They wanted a sort of very stilted religion, if one at all, for the enslaved. So they meet in secret. They build community. They pray for one another. They combine those old rituals with new beliefs. They clandestinely learn. It's illegal for the enslaved to learn how to read and write, but they clandestinely learn that the Bible is actually a liberatory text full of enslaved people who are striving to get free. And look at that. And so they really saw themselves in that text and embraced that radical possibility of a vision of freedom and a future and God's favor. And they connect it to themselves, and it becomes a means of survival. It becomes a means of supporting one another and strengthening them for a terrible fight for freedom.
Yeah, it's interesting because I see, many people will know that the church is still a pretty big has a big role in Black communities, and whether you're the most religious person or not is a very strong cultural thing, which there's such a unique history there for that, which I think
it's
is
the first real Black institution, right? It's a space where people can talk to each other frankly, where they can support their own. And so many of those secret churches become real churches in freedom, and they bolster people in surviving that Reconstruction time period and into Jim Crow as independent institutions that can be the ground by which politics can give birth and support can give birth. And so it's no accident that they are often targeted and attacked when Black people are organizing throughout American history, because they are that one independent institution.
Yeah. So you have, I think it's 2 chapters in the book on Black washerwomen, which they were absolutely fascinating. It's not a lot I knew about that history, and so it was wonderful to read about and learn a lot of these different things. So could you give, I guess, the overview of this type of work, how it was received in the segregated South? And there was this wild stat you put in the book that Black women made up only 11% of U.S. population in 1900, but did 65% of the work that washerwomen did, which is absolutely wild. So how did that progress and change over time? And so just kind of give us the overview here of this kind of, or this type of work that was being done for many years.
So most of us live in homes that have washing machines in them, or we go to a laundromat where everything you can get your laundry done. But that doesn't really exist until probably the 1950s.
And even then, it wasn't widespread, right? People were still hanging stuff outside and everything.
Yes, it was still a new technology. It's probably not till the 1960s where you have like a lot of households with both a washer and a dryer inside of it. And so the work of doing laundry by hand is quite arduous, requires making soap, boiling water, adding bluing chemicals to get whites white, ironing all those things by hand.
I don't like putting it in the thing and clicking a button and taking it out. I mean, and then folding it and putting it away sucks. No one likes doing it. So, I mean, that we complain about that. It was so different, 70 years ago. It was so different. It was a whole. It was like a day. It was like a whole thing. It was a week.
It was a whole week.
The whole thing. It's goodness.
And so Black women did that work. And of course, when they were in bondage, they did that for everybody. Harriet Tubman sets up a wash house for the Civil War soldiers and staffs it with Black women. So they sort of become like key to the war effort under her guidance. It's historically, those women were experts in doing that work. And so when they become free, they're like, oh, so we're going to keep doing this work, but we're going to do it the way that we want to. And so in my research, I discovered that they systematically decided that, this work would not happen in concert with doing other kinds of household chores. It would not be, you would be the maid and the washerwoman. It would not happen inside of white homes under white supervision. They would take the laundry out. They would wash it at home on a schedule. They would bring it back at the end of the week. And that schedule and that autonomy really becomes the universal standard in the American South. I mean, I'm sure there's someone who did it differently somewhere, but in mass, that's what happened, and that's Black women's determination. That's labor organizing, and it's a really powerful reminder that they understood completely the value that they had with a real monopoly on this labor, and they weren't paid a lot, but they could determine how the work was done and under what conditions. And those conditions created a buffer against sexual assault from being inside white homes. It provided time for them to create their own households, which they could not do as enslaved women. And it gave them time to raise their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, the way they saw fit. And so it's a really first powerful work from home movement.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think reading about it and kind of hearing the independence and the autonomy, or beginning to have that in the ways that you listed, was, I think, was super illuminating. I guess one question on that is, obviously there's, I mean, even still today, obviously there's some terrible remnants, but for a long time into the 20th century, the South has not always been the best place for Black folks. I mean, and kind of global, or state by state or region by region. I mean, obviously we talk about Jim Crow South and segregation. That's not to say that those things didn't happen in other places as well.
Segregation was invented in the North.
Right. So it happened everywhere.
First free populations were the first segregated population. So when you see gradual emancipation in the North, that's where it began. So in Massachusetts and New York State are the first segregation laws. So Jim Crow is American.
Yeah, it's a good reminder. It's a good reminder.
That's my first book.
I'll have to get you back on for that one. Okay. But I guess for this piece here, for the washerwomen, was it different in certain parts of the country? So like how the treatment, or even in terms of pay, or what they could or couldn't do, how was this received, I guess, whether it was in the Midwest or the North or the South or wherever? How did it, I guess, look different, or what was the variance in different parts of the country?
I think, for the most part, there were some greater autonomy and a less of a threat for Black women who were in different parts of the country, in terms of how you could use what you earned to upbuild a life. But for the most part, they weren't prosperous anywhere, unless they, the prosperity that we could see, and prosperity with a little tiny p, is really through collectivity. When women who banded together to cover more households as a group. Folks who were known for their particular skills, who had several different households, or maybe started to employ different women to work for them in their own yards, those kinds of things. So we see some variation, but washerwomen are never really valued in any part of the country as and it's not a variance that I would say really mattered. But Black women were attracted to the work because of the independence and the space and the safety from sexual assault.
You talk about some of the union efforts that washerwomen were involved in, whether it's Atlanta in 1881, Raleigh in 1873 and 85, Richmond in 1904. I guess obviously there were many things going on. We'll talk about some unions in a minute, but how was their involvement a part of this kind of developing Black working class to say, here's what we want, here's how we want to do things, here's some of our, I don't want to say demands, but how do we have these things that we're asking for to be treated well? I guess what was their kind of part of the story in these union efforts at different points?
I think it's important to remember that, oftentimes when we talk about unions, we think of it as needing someone on the outside to create a consciousness to tell people how to think about it. That you have to go in there, you have to organize the people, you have to tell them, you have to teach them, and then they'll move once they have that training. My favorite organization of washerwomen is in 1865 in Jackson, Mississippi. So they come out of enslavement and immediately organize a set of demands, demanding a living wage, demanding time off for Sundays, demanding to do the work on their own, and saying that, everybody needs to join or they're going to get in trouble with them. Right. So that, straight union outlook from the very beginning. And so no one came in and no one gave them consciousness. And they had been in bondage, a few weeks before. And they had a full sense of what they needed as workers. And so for me, washerwomen are a reminder. Now, oftentimes they would join other union efforts and they would join in efforts to challenge segregation and disfranchisement. But boy, they understood the power of their work and the power of collectivity from the very beginning, and no consciousness raising from the outside was necessary.
That's a really important point, because I think we tend to think about it that way from the outside. Let's train and educate and hear, and it sounds like it's like
we think of working class people as not being intellectuals.
Right. No, I mean, but listen, I mean, if anybody studied any of those movements of union efforts, especially in different parts of our history, different types of folks in different groups, yeah, even more currently too. I mean, there's people that are organized and thoughtful. They've thought about it, and it's hard work and it takes a long time. But yeah, it's definitely interesting to think about, again, some more of the stereotypes. So I've read this part in the book. So you have this great line. So this is I read this and I said, "Ooh, this is interesting. Interesting topic here." There's this great line you have which says, "The artificial standards of white femininity, the real status of a household notwithstanding, were dependent on Black washerwomen." So I could see this being a little dicey. I don't want to pit it as Black versus white. I know that's terrible, but how do you see these dynamics between Black women and white women at this time, as that line illustrates? And basically the way I read that is, white women they want this standard, they want this way of living, and how they want to have these things about what it means to be feminine. But that's on the backs of Black women doing this type of work, something that maybe white women didn't do, right? As we mentioned earlier, 65% of laundry workers were doing that, or were Black women, excuse me. So I guess talk about that first at the time, and then how do we see echoes of that still today?
My favorite story that I found was of a former slaveholder whose all of his slaves had left the plantation, of course, after freedom, and there was no one there to do the laundry. And he had daughters, and he was an elderly man, but he said he would do the laundry for the family before shaming his daughters into doing it. And so for me, that was like, oh, okay, that's a powerful and interesting example.
Yeah.
That to have his daughters be in the yard, be seen, boiling the water and making soap and hanging the clotheslines would be such a degradation in the middle of losing the entire world as they knew it. Right. So everything was gone. The value that they had in the enslaved was gone. The world was torn up in war. And God forbid his daughters wash their own clothes. So for me, that was like a life lesson on like, okay, this is what it meant. And this is why Black women had a monopoly on the job, because no matter what was going on, women who were quite poor, who couldn't afford someone to clean their home or cook inside their home or watch their children, would pay Black women to wash their clothes because it was seen as Black people's work. And that line, the line that created between Black and white during enslavement stood in freedom. So much so that work was so stigmatized that white women did not want to do it.
do we? I mean, it's pretty astounding. I mean, how do we see that? I guess today. I mean, there's certain jobs, certain in terms of the workforce. I mean, I guess you could make it more socially or culturally too, but where no one's saying it, but you know, this is the work that black folks are going to do, but maybe not so much white women or white folks. I mean, how do we see? I guess traces of that still.
I taught at NC State for 20 years, and I had a student who was an engineering student, and he was taking my class for requirements. But he was very earnest and came to my office hours pretty much every week and talked over things. He wasn't used to reading long books and things like that because of his field. But he was a real good kid and very earnest young white man. And he said, "Oh, Dr. Kelley, I have my big job interview for my engineering job." I think he was a box engineer or something. He like made some boxes so things didn't break on the inside.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was going to interview at this factory for this important engineering position. And he came back that next week and he said, "Dr. Kelley," he said, "I saw the space in a way I wouldn't have seen it before." He said, "I saw who was working on the floor, making the boxes. I saw who was supervising. I saw who was the executive in the company." And he said, "I saw who was cleaning."
Mm.
And he said, they were all separate. And I never would have seen that before your class. I never would have even thought about it. But, there were lines. He's like, "So if I go to work for this place, I don't want those lines to stay like that. I want to challenge that because I just wouldn't have noticed it." And so I think, if we all are a little bit more conscious about how we look at working spaces, we will see those lines, and hopefully we'll begin to challenge them wherever we are, to make sure that there are pathways for us to not remake racial division by default.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. So you talk about this great migration, which is interesting. Um, in this part, we'll come to it later, but you talk about some of the areas close to home for me on over here in Maryland in the Eastern Shore, which is I read that with much interest, very interesting. So this great migration, how is it transformative for a lot of working class Black folks? How did it impact region and communities and environments? And I think you say that there's 6 million Black folks left the South and came to places in the Northeast and the Midwest and the West. Um, how much of this, I think you make it somewhere in the book about that this was fleeing some of the oppressive nature of where they were and not just let's seek a better opportunity somewhere. And so I guess maybe talk about that great migration and some of the rationale or the reason for so many folks doing that at that time.
Historians talk about the push and the pull of the migration. They were, of course, leaving places, sometimes under direct threat. I believe my family that was in Eastern Shore of Maryland, there was a family member who was accused of something against a white person, and the entire broad family who had been there in slavery and freedom were free before Civil War, had some land, left it all, and evacuated. My family in South Carolina seems to have done the same thing. I don't even know quite why, but they left Newberry, South Carolina, and moved in mass to Thomasville, and then eventually on to Philadelphia and the Philadelphia area. And so oftentimes people were running to escape lynching and violence and attacks and accusations from local whites, murders, any number of things that happened to people to make them run. Other people were just fed up. I start the book with my ancestor, Solicitor Duncan, who was a sharecropper and realized that he was never going to make any money sharecropping, that the landholder was going to say he owed money over and over again and tie him in perpetuity to the space. So he had to run. My mother always said like a slave. And so many people were just so frustrated with the lack of opportunity that they thought, let's see if we can have opportunity maybe in a small southern town. And then, others were saying, let's go to this Chicago, let's go to this Philadelphia, New York. From Texas, they would go out west. From Louisiana, they would go to Detroit, Ohio. The train routes would carve out the ways in which people moved. Oftentimes, they would have family members who were already there, so they would try to remake community. There was a broad community of people from the Eastern Shore of Maryland and Virginia in Philadelphia, for example. Both my grandparents were from the Eastern Shore. My grandmother's from the Eastern Shore of Maryland. My grandfather's from the Eastern Shore of Virginia. They did not know each other until they got to Philadelphia. I'm pretty sure there was some little cliques going on up there where they would meet each other. And so those kinds of escapes were a big push, but they were quick to also hope that these other spaces would offer better economic opportunities, a relief from some of the segregation and domination that was happening in the South. And they were, right? The sort of everyday insult of segregation that existed in the Southern cities was gone. But they were confronted with awful housing and very small job opportunities, particularly in the first generations.
Yeah, one of the ways that people will question if Maryland is part of the South, and it is part of the South. It is part of the South, and I always point to people. I say, go to St. Mary's County in Southern Maryland, or go out to the Eastern Shore, and you'll see lots
below
of
the Mason-Dixon line.
You'll see remnants. You'll see remnants there. There's a lot of remnants there. And I remember reading that in the book, and I was like, I know from today, and I've traveled my whole state, and the Eastern Shore is very different than the Western Shore. Most of Maryland is side of the bay, and I can't even imagine 100 years ago, 120 years ago, what it was like to come from the Eastern Shore then to even Baltimore or even Philadelphia. I mean, it's just a totally different world in some ways. People that grow up and they're around there, that region, and then you're dealing with all of these direct threats. Okay, going and leaving that area, which is rural in some aspects, and then going to a city is a whole other set of issues and challenges, especially having been there. I mean, that's a very that even though it's, again, you're talking about the same state or the next state over, quite different again to this kind of what you're saying, this whole remaking again kind of idea.
Yes.
Is I that stuck out to me. And maybe again it's just because it's my backyard or whatever, but I was very much struck by that idea of kind of uprooting and going to a different region, I guess. It is very regionally, it's different. It's for
I was
folks that don't
thinking
know,
about that when I was looking at one of the oral histories that I use of the woman who migrates from Minnie, who migrates from Accomack County around the same time that my grandfather does, into Philadelphia, and just getting off the train in the middle of Philadelphia must have been striking. And she was a teenager, and just trying to make her way. And so it's again that reminder of the humanness of the survival of the, for me, that there's so much to admire in the folks who were able to brave these challenges and make a life for themselves.
So I have two kind of big, two last big kind of, I guess, topics here, which we can hit. Which is, one is you talk about the all black railroad union and the brotherhood of the sleeping car porter. Yeah. In 1936, and there was an emphasis on fair pay, equal protection, equal opportunity, and the Pullman company that was also involved in helping workers. I guess the one question I have here is, what makes, I guess, this distinct or sets it apart, being an all-black railroad union, from other types of unions that we hear about? Just kind of, we were talking in the beginning, these kind of the white working class and their unions that they did. Again, not either, kind of pitted against each other, but I want to know some of the distinctive features for, obviously, again, different there's, I think, a lot of things that maybe are uniting people. People of any sort want to have equal pay and fair pay, equal protection. I think a lot of people that are doing a union want that. But I guess what are some of the distinctive features of this union?
So again, it's the accident of a monopoly. George Mortimer Pullman, who was the founder of the Pullman Palace Car Company, who creates the comfortable sleeping car on long distance trains. He rents these trains out with Black workers on board. Um, you know, let's think about the racial politics of renting the men to these train companies. But they work for the Pullman company. They never work for the train companies, because he's trying to create what he believes will be a romantic hearkening back to enslavement, having a Black manservant waiting on you hand and foot, providing any requests as you travel on the train, and that they would be elegant and understated and quiet and not too educated, and but slightly educated enough so that they could be of service. And so he thought of Black men as the perfect Pullman porter. And so they take those jobs en masse. Eventually, there are a few Filipino Asian workers who are hired on the West Coast to do Pullman porter work, but the overwhelming majority of the Pullman porters were Black men. So much so it becomes the largest private employer of Black people in the country. And so they begin to organize a union. They're really reliant on tips. There's really no limitation on how many hours they'll be tasked with working. Sometimes they have to ride a train to another location to start working, and then they don't get paid for that time. And it was a real exploitative kind of sense of what you were due to do this kind of work. And so they begin to organize. It takes them more than a decade of really fighting the Pullman company tooth and nail. They have the company employs spies and tries to set up a fake union. They do all kinds of internecine work to try and foil the union. But folks like A. Philip Randolph and C.L. Dellums are really wonderful, articulate visionaries for what can happen. And they speak with the voice of these Pullman porters who know what they're owed and go to great lengths to sacrifice to get it. And what becomes powerful about this union when it's successful in the wake of the New Deal with new legislation is that they don't care just about the Pullman porters. They immediately pivot to concerns about Black workers in general, about demanding access for defense workers to be hired, Black workers to be in those defense jobs in the war, that they have equal opportunity. And so FDR is pushed to put in place executive orders that give equal access to federal employment for Black workers in those industries. And they become the basis by which the civil rights movement has another foundation. And they use their mobility, their organizational heft, not just to improve their own circumstances, but to really lift Black people as a whole. So it's a powerful union in that it's not just a selfish exploit, but really that again back to that collective ethic that comes out of enslavement.
Yeah, and it sounds like it becomes more expansive. I mean, you talk about a decade, that's a long time to work on something.
Absolutely.
And, still having to deal with, while you're working on it, the things you're working for, you still have to go through as you patiently have to keep waiting for. So it's again, just tremendous determination and grit in a lot of ways. So you talk about also Black maids. You mentioned things like the help, and you talk about mammies, which were these types of stereotypes that we've had of workers in the past. Could you talk about how those stereotypes arose, how we do or don't see them today? And I mean, when I read this chapter, I could see it in the other ones too, but I just from this one with Black maids, I couldn't imagine not understanding that without having an understanding of slavery in the United States. I mean, there just
Hmm.
seems, I don't know, there just seems to be this like a lot of this. I mean, it's not necessarily linear, but that there is a kind of through line there.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I think you'd have to be pretty foolish and dumb to not see that. I mean, for anyone
Hmm.
reading it, faithfully, I think to see that. So I guess talk about that and how we had these terrible stereotypes and things like that.
I think it's really a great question to connect it to, and there really is literal policy loopholes
Mm,
that provide the space so that in the middle of the 20th century, um, Black women doing domestic labor are excluded from the labor protections that come in the New Deal and in its wake. They are not bound to a set number of hours in a day. They're not bound to a base pay by hour, and they are not protected with the social safety net. In part because Southern legislators and people who hired them in households didn't want to pay that much or to be limited in how much work could be given, particularly to women who served as domestic live-in servants, like my grandmother, Brunel Duncan,
mm,
who I write about in the book.
mm,
So that they would live in the household with white families. They would wake up often at dawn to sort of get the day started and start meals, cook, clean, um, do laundry in those machines that were now in the house, um, and really watch children, make dinner, help host a dinner party, watch children if folks went out for the evening.
mhm,
And so that they ended up with these extraordinarily long days where they were really obligated, isolated from each other, isolated from their families and from their own children, um, and not uh, able to really have very many rights, not much privacy. Oftentimes, their beds would be in basements or in closets or hallways.
mm,
Um, Pallets, roll up pallets that they were forced to sleep on to do this labor. And so it was really extraordinarily hard for an entire generation of Black women. Um, but these were the jobs that they could get. And it was powerful for me to see that the number of domestic women doing domestic labor increased as we went into the 20th century. Oftentimes we think of it, as that through line between slavery and
mm.
freedom, but women were coming out of agricultural work and going into domestic work through the Second World War. Uh, one of my favorite realizations is that this image of Rosie the Riveter, the white woman worker called to defense work because her husband is drafted abroad to fight in the war. Rosie the Riveter has a Black woman maid.
Mm,
There's someone to watch her children to keep her household going.
mhm,
Black women were oftentimes not hired in these better paying industrial jobs during the war, and instead could really only serve in domestic roles. And so it's an interesting. There's a through line, but there's also the particularities of these histories and the changing shape of the economy um, that makes it quite something.
So two things here. One is it just I know I'm trying tread carefully on this. When people talk about, I guess, women's rights and the history of women's rights in the United States, it is, I think, maybe I'm wrong. I mean, again, I'm not the historian, but for white women, when you talk about suffragettes and being able to vote in 1920 and the whole thing, and then being able to work in the workforce starting, I guess, after post World War II, 1950s and 60s, and going to 70s. But that it just seems like there was a different um, yeah, parallel reality, but an unequal one for Black women. I mean,
Yeah.
is that too pedestrian to say, or
No,
how?
I mean, I can't find the generation of women in my family that did not work. So coming out of slavery, Black women worked. They did domestic labor, they did agricultural labor, they did factory work. There really is no generation of Black women who don't in mass work, in majority work. And so, again, if we don't tell working class women's stories through Black women's stories, we're missing a big part of it. And Black women participated in those suffragette movements as well. And they are calling out the particularities of Black women. They are calling for women's clubs. They're calling for nursery care, and they start some of the first public urban nurseries in the United States for Black women. And so we changed the narrative. We're the canaries in the coal mine of what will be American women's challenges in the workforce.
The second point I had on that was, you're talking about the kind of live-in maid situation. And again, this kind of goes to kind of the distinction here. So, I'm Latin, and so part of my history that I understand about various places in Latin America, it's not everywhere, but certain places in Latin America will have a similar kind of thing. Usually, if you want to call it upper middle class or more affluent Latin folks, usually in kind of big major capital cities up and down the Western Hemisphere, in more modern times, we'll have live-in maids, right? People that they hire and they pay them, and maybe not great, but they pay them and it's a job and they work long hours, things like that, and maybe have them, have them stay there, or have a room for them, things like that. And it is a kind of a privileged or kind of elite thing, that certain places in Latin America do, but it feels, again, each country has its own history and stuff, but that just feels different than having Black folks do that because of the history. Well, because of the history. Because of the history. This
is a question.
The history here is like, well, wait a minute. I mean, how do you have this discussion, or this, I don't want to say debate, but this discussion of how do we have, if you're paying somebody and you're paying somebody for work that they're doing, but also knowing that maybe it's not completely fair treatment, regardless of where it's at, but then also because of somebody's, what opportunities or what accessibility do they have to doing certain things? If that's the only job you can get, or that's the one that you're hired, that's the one you're chosen for. And again, each country is different. And again, I don't know the history of every country, but it just feels a little bit different because of, like, there's such for Black folks, this was happening during, segregation. This was, 100 years or so post Civil War. Like that almost feels, that feels too close in some ways, where it's like, yes, you have, you're not enslaved. Okay, there's that freedom piece. Yes, you're being paid. Yes, you can have some things, but it's still not. It's not fair pay. It's not good protection. It's not how we would have many other things. And I don't know how it would be other places, but I don't know. Is that? I don't know how it is today. I don't know if people still do that. Do people still do that today? Do people have, like, nannies? I have no idea.
They do.
I have no. I just, how do we have that conversation, I guess, is my question. How do we have that?
It's powerful when you think there's a really rich literature of people thinking about the shared conditions that household workers deal with. In most places in the world, household workers are the dispossessed. They tend to be the least powerful. They tend to be indigenous or foreign or Black or first generation to a country. They tend to suffer from stereotypes. They tend to suffer from a lack of concern about their whole lives, their children, their families, their needs. They tend to be suffer from a terrible anonymity,
Mm.
where people don't pay attention to the things that they really need in ways that we might pay attention to. If we're a manager at our job, we might think, oh, well, she just had a baby. Da, 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 this is how it's going to work. For a few weeks, she's going to have to do this or that, the other thing. And they would, negotiate with a worker to set up circumstances that work better for her. And oftentimes, domestic workers aren't given that same grace or understanding or even thought. And so for me, the example of the Black women who are doing this work parallel some of the same kinds of lack of concern that we have for women doing this kind of work today. And we could do better. And I bet if you look at some of those countries you're thinking about, there are layers of exploitation and dispossession that are at play.
So I'm positive that's probably the case. Unfortunately, yes. Listen, I'm sure there is. I mean, it's terrible. Each country's got its own history.
Yes.
I don't know how I feel about that.
I think the way to feel about it is just to think substantively about what workers deserve. About boundaries and limitations and advocacy for fair pay and really stop atomizing those situations, right? So you are the employer, they are the employee. So you start to think, oh well, I don't have that much money, but I really do need help. So that's kind of logics that people slip into instead of saying this is the person who has a household and a family, and they have their time, they have their own interests, and how do I respect those things? How do I thank them? How do I appreciate them? How do I give them paid time off? How do I see that they have access to health care and the things they need to be in my household? And Black women that I study, my grandmother didn't have those things. She didn't. I put a story in the book about my mother coming to visit her across Philadelphia, and then she not being allowed to take my mom back home. And so she put her on a streetcar with a note around her neck, tied to a ribbon before my mother could read, and said, look for a Black woman and sit next to her and ask her to help you. I mean, so my preschool age mother sitting on the streetcar in Philadelphia going home because her employer wouldn't let her take her child home. These are the kinds of reminders that women are leaving their children by themselves to cook and clean in households for days at a time because they don't have any alternative. That those kinds of things were happening to them because they didn't have the power or the representation from the country to do something different.
Yeah, I mean, I hear these stories and it's always like almost disarming. Like I know they happen, I know they're real, but it's every time you hear it, it's like how do we have that happen to people? Like it always is a I think a good real reminder, and think we can continue to progress better. So I guess the last two questions here is what about currently? So what does the current Black working class look like? You talk about some stuff with folks that worked in the USPS. You talk about some of the workers during the pandemic. I guess you could talk about either one of those things, but I guess my main question here is how do we think about the Black working class in 2023 and currently, and how do we have good conversations collectively and individually about Black working folks?
I think we have to make sure that we are thinking about the humanity of workers today. That we are figuring out ways that we can support folks who want to do union work, who want a living wage, who deserve access to good health care, paid time off. The pandemic drew into sharp relief the degree to which the many essential workers were Black workers, were Latinx workers, were folks who don't have a lot of rights. I go to a traditional African American church here in my community, and many of the men and women I go to church with, they were never off. They were never not at work during the pandemic. They didn't experience this sort of, a month of being in the house and not being at work. They were the essential workers, and they were working every day through all of that. Some of their colleagues were sickened. Some of their colleagues did not survive. And so we have to use this moment to think substantively about what workers deserve, about the humanity of those workers, about their own households, their own lives, their futures, and how we can build up a society that rewards labor, because it's all important, it's all skilled, it's all vital to our survival as a nation. And we have to get out of the idea that some people are going to be at this lower strata and that's just what it is. And you should just work harder, because everybody's working hard, and all those folks are needed. I'm very concerned about, and I'm thinking about writing a new project that sort of draws a closer attention to the gig economy and the way in which automation of driving may have an effect on the Black working class going forward. And it's a really powerful set of questions and ethical questions that I think this history forces us to ask.
Yeah, that's great. Well, the book is called Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. It's out everywhere now. You've been doing a looks like an awesome tour for the book. So where's the best place for people to see you or reach you online, or where are the best places to get at you?
My favorite haunt is still Twitter. That sinking ship that it is. And I'm Prof, like PROF BLM Kelley on Twitter. I also have an Instagram with the same handle. And I'm on faculty at UNC.
No, that's great. Blair, this was such a lovely conversation, really, really wonderful. I learned a lot from your book. I was super enriched from talking with you about it, and thank you so much for your time and your energy. I'm very, very, very grateful and very pleased that we could have the conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was great.
Absolutely.